Welcome, dear listener, to a book written in the middle of the First World War in 1916 by a man who had spent his whole career trying to answer one deceptively simple question. What actually makes a human life count for something? The author is Orison Swett Marden, whose books we spent quite a bit of time with together by now. Marden knew, from painful first-hand experience, both what it felt like to have almost nothing and what it felt like to build something real out of that nothing. Orphaned young, worked nearly to the bone as a farm boy. He clawed his way to an education and to real success, only to lose a fortune in a devastating fire, and then rebuild his whole career around a single conviction that raw talent matters far less than most people assume, and that character, patiently built day by day, is what actually determines whether a life turns out to be a masterpiece or, in his own blunt phrase, a wretched, distorted daub. This particular book opens with a striking contrast that sets the tone for everything that follows. Marden tells us of two men who died within a few weeks of each other. One was a famously successful professional gambler, gifted, intelligent, cultured, a man who could have been, in Marden's words, a king among men, yet who left behind nothing but the reputation of having played a crooked game very well. The other was a naturalist, John Muir, a man who fought tirelessly, often against powerful and hostile interests, to preserve some of the most magnificent wilderness in America, and whose death every newspaper in the country mourned as a genuine national loss. Same world, same era, two entirely different masterpieces or daubs left behind. So let's walk together through the 17 chapters Marden built around this one central idea. In the opening chapter, which gives the whole book its title, Marden insists that every human career is, whether we realize it or not, a picture being painted, one that will eventually hang in what he calls civilization's gallery. He is careful here to draw a sharp distinction between merely earning a living and actually making a life. Getting food, clothing, and shelter, he argues, was never meant to be the main point of our existence, but only, in his words, a mere incidental in the Creator's plan. Even amid the ruins of the First World War, Marden points to the countless ordinary people in Belgium who had lost everything, their homes, their businesses, sometimes even their families, and yet had emerged from that devastation somehow bigger, nobler people than they had been before, because no bomb or siege gun could ever touch their untarnished character. Marden closes this chapter with a declaration he clearly wants us to carry with us through the whole rest of the book. Under God, I am my own maker, my own destiny. I am the master of my fate, the captain of my soul. From this foundation, Marden turns to a chapter he calls Practical Dreamers, defending imagination against the common charge that it is merely idle and impractical. He reminds us that every real castle standing today was, at some earlier point, nothing more than a castle in the air, a plan existing only inside someone's mind before it ever became brick and mortar. He walks us through Elias Howe and his sewing machine, Eli Whitney and his cotton gin, and the young, ridiculed Wright brothers, insisting that practically every great inventor in history was first dismissed by their own contemporaries as an idle visionary or a hopeless crank. The real difference, Marden insists, between what he calls a practical dreamer and a mere idle one is simply this. The practical dreamer keeps right on toiling, putting actual foundation under his vision, rather than leaving it forever floating, ungrounded, somewhere up in the clouds of pure imagination. Now Marden turns to a chapter called Where Your Opportunity Is, built around a wonderful string of stories about hidden fortunes. He tells us of a Pennsylvania farmer who sold his land for a few $100s, only for the new owner to discover, quite by accident, one of the most valuable oil deposits in American history, bubbling up right through his own cattle trough. He shares the old Persian parable of Ali Haft, a prosperous farmer who sold his fertile land and wandered the world in a fruitless, lifelong search for diamonds, only to die penniless and heartbroken in some distant country, entirely unaware that the very farm he had so carelessly sold behind him contained, all along, the fabulously rich diamond mines of Golconda. Marden's central point here is direct and personal. Most of us are, in exactly the same way, standing right now on our own unrecognized acres of diamonds, and our task is never really to go searching for some distant, greener field, but simply to dig with real persistence, right where our own 2 feet already happen to be standing. From opportunity, Marden moves into a chapter on what he calls the triumph of common virtues. He shares here Ruskin's lovely observation that ordinary soot and mud, chemically speaking, are really nothing more than distant cousins of diamonds and sapphires, waiting only for the patient work needed to properly develop them. In exactly the same spirit, Marden insists that most truly successful lives are built, not out of some rare and dazzling genius, but simply out of very ordinary human qualities, honesty, industry, and sound judgment, intensified and sustained far beyond what most people are ever willing to bother with. He reminds us that even Henry Ward Beecher was considered, as a boy, hopelessly dull and slow, and that Abraham Lincoln's own greatness, when you actually examine it closely, turns out to be built from nothing more exotic than industry, thoroughness, simple kindliness, and absolutely unshakable persistence, the very same raw materials, Marden insists, available to every single one of us. This leads naturally into a chapter Marden calls Keeping at It as a Miracle Worker, built entirely around the sheer, quiet power of persistence. He shares the memorable, slightly comic image of a plucky old Dutchman who, after losing 12 straight foot races to the very same rival, still firmly refuses to admit defeat, insisting simply by chimney, "I never gives up." Marden reminds us here of Columbus's famous, dogged answer to his own increasingly desperate and mutinous crew when they demanded to know what they should do once all their hope was finally exhausted. Sail on, and on. There is, Marden insists, a very real kind of miracle worked by nothing more dramatic than sheer, patient-sticking power. The simple refusal to turn back one single day before final victory quietly arrives. Now Marden turns his attention to something more physical, in a chapter called Masterfulness and Physical Vigor. Here he makes an argument that must have felt genuinely fresh in his own era, that working longer, harder hours is not actually the same thing as accomplishing more. He points approvingly to the recent shortening of the standard workday from 9 hours down to 8, noting that output did not fall as so many business owners had feared, but if anything slightly improved, because well-rested workers brought noticeably more energy and enthusiasm to each and every hour they did work. Vitality, Marden insists here quite firmly, is our single most valuable form of working capital, and squandering it recklessly through poor habits, insufficient rest, or plain carelessness is nothing short of a serious kind of self-robbery. From here, Marden takes up a chapter called Curing the Curse of Indecision, opening with the great British Admiral Nelson's own memorable rule for himself. "When I don't know whether to fight or not, I always fight." Marden argues here that the habit of endlessly wavering, weighing, and reconsidering our own decisions is one of the most quietly damaging habits a person can develop, since it leaves the mind perpetually cluttered and drains away, through pure indecision, precious energy that ought instead to be spent on decisive, forward action. His practical remedy here is refreshingly direct. gather the best information you reasonably can, make your honest decision promptly, and then, having made it, absolutely refuse to reopen the question purely out of anxious, wavering second thoughts. Now Marden turns to a chapter he calls Unlocking Your Possibilities, open with the remarkable and largely unexpected rise of Napoleon during the chaos of the French Revolution, and drawing a direct, deliberate parallel to the many previously unknown soldiers who, in Marden's own contemporary European war, were suddenly discovering entirely unsuspected reserves of genuine courage and raw ability within themselves. He shares once again the striking story of Ulysses Grant, a man who drifted, seemingly quite unremarkably, through his first 39 years of life, failing rather quietly at one modest job after another, until the sudden, tremendous crisis of civil war abruptly revealed, almost overnight, one of the truly great military minds of that entire century. Most of us, Marden insists here, remain genuine strangers to our own deepest and most hidden selves, simply because we have never yet been placed under quite the right kind of pressure needed to reveal what has actually been sleeping quietly inside us the whole time. Let's pause here for just a moment before we move on into the second half of Marden's book. If this walk through his ideas about persistence, vigor, and hidden possibility is giving you something worth carrying into your own day, consider subscribing to the channel, so these kinds of reflections keep finding their way to you at this same steady pace. Now let's continue on. Marden next takes up a chapter called Bettering Our Best, opening with the Sculptor Award's memorable reply when asked which of his own works he considered his very best. My next, Marden insists that most truly great achievement in this world comes not from a handful of rare, dazzling, brilliant strokes of genius, but from a quiet, steady, almost unglamorous habit of trying, day after day, to slightly improve on whatever we managed to accomplish just yesterday. He shares Andrew Carnegie's own famously terse response upon hearing that his workers had just broken every previous production record in the company's history. Why not do it every day? This everyday habit of quietly bettering one's own best, Marden insists, will, given enough time, carry an entirely ordinary person very far indeed beyond the reach of someone considerably more naturally gifted, who nonetheless remains content to simply coast along on that gift alone. From here, Marden turns to a chapter on what he calls the will to succeed, opening with a vivid comparison between a powerful artillery shell, which requires exactly the right charge of propulsive powder behind it to actually reach its intended target, and a merely half-hearted human ambition, which, lacking that same driving force of genuine determination behind it, likewise falls well short of its own intended mark. Marden tells us here the charming story of a young Cornelius Vanderbilt, who, applying for his very first modest job, deliberately declined to use his own famous grandfather's name to help smooth his way, wanting instead to earn a position entirely and honestly on his own merit. A quiet act of pure self-reliance that reportedly so pleased the old Commodore himself that he added an entire extra $1 million to the boy's eventual inheritance. Now Marden takes up a chapter he calls the backbone of manhood, built almost entirely around the simple, old-fashioned, yet genuinely durable value of honesty. He shares here the story of a young Confederate courier who overheard General Lee's own private battle plans and immediately reported them, a report so completely and instantly trusted by his commanding officer, purely because of the boy's own well-known, spotless reputation for absolute truthfulness, that it directly changed the entire course of one of the war's most pivotal battles. Marden reminds us here, too, of a young and still struggling Abraham Lincoln, who once flatly refused to argue the wrong side of a legal case, explaining candidly that he simply could not do it. Since the whole time he was speaking to the jury, he would hear an inner voice steadily repeating, "Lincoln, you're a liar, you're a liar," and feared he might eventually blurt the accusation out loud, without even meaning to. From honesty, Marden turns to a chapter with a wonderfully direct title, Shrinking from the Disagreeable. Here he shares a simple but genuinely powerful motto of a business friend of his, who kept the words "do the hardest thing first" hanging directly above his own desk. Marden argues that so very many people fail in life for no more dramatic reason than this. They habitually pick out the easy, pleasant tasks first, and then quietly, almost unconsciously, put off the genuinely difficult ones until those difficult, avoided tasks pile up so heavily behind them that they eventually block the entire path forward completely. Now Marden takes up a chapter he calls the kingship of self-control, opening with Herbert Spencer's memorable observation that the supreme mastery of oneself represents one of the true perfections of the fully ideal human being. Marden shares here the genuinely moving story of a distinguished college professor who served real prison time for some act committed in a sudden, uncontrolled fit of anger, and who, upon his eventual release, simply and quietly resumed teaching his very same class exactly where it left off, beginning again with the plain words, as I was saying, having patiently used those long, difficult years of confinement to finally master the one remaining fatal flaw in his own otherwise admirable character from self-mastery. Marden turns to a genuinely practical chapter he calls An Hour a Day, built entirely around the sheer, quiet power of small amounts of well-used time, faithfully repeated. He reminds us that a single steady hour of focused reading each and every day would allow any ordinary person to work through roughly 18 substantial volumes over the course of just one single year. He shares the inspiring story of a former field hand and household servant who patiently used her own scattered, scarce spare hours to prepare herself for college, and who went on to become a thoroughly successful practicing physician. The real secret Marden offers us here is refreshingly and reassuringly simple. It is never really the rare, occasional, dramatic burst of effort that quietly transforms a life, but rather the small, patient, honest hour, faithfully and consistently repeated, day after day after day. Now Marden turns to a chapter called Finding Your Place, opening with a lovely, gentle scene borrowed from Maeterlinck's play The Blue Bird, in which unborn children are shown eagerly crowding aboard old Father Time's ship, each one already clutching in a small hand their own particular life commission, one destined to become an artist, another an engineer, another a poet. Marden's argument here is that every single person carries within them some genuine talent, uniquely their own, and that the true secret of a happy, productive, well-spent life lies mainly in the patient, honest work of actually discovering what that talent truly is, rather than simply drifting, almost by pure accident, into whatever job or vocation happens to present itself first. From vocation, Marden turns to a chapter on what he calls the secret of happiness, opening with former Harvard President Charles Eliot's memorable observation that we must always be careful to give proper and honest weight to the good side of any event that genuinely has two sides, since even a fierce and destructive storm that wrecks certain unlucky ships along the way will, at the very same time, be busily watering 10,000 different farms further inland. Marden insists here that happiness is never really a matter of favorable outward circumstances at all, but is instead a settled, deliberate habit of mind, one we can genuinely train and cultivate in ourselves. choosing quite deliberately again and again to look steadily toward the bright, hopeful side of nearly everything that happens to us. And finally, in his closing chapter, Marden takes up what he calls living the finer senses, drawing a sharp and deliberate distinction between the coarser, purely animal instincts that occupy the lower, more primitive part of the human brain, and the far finer, more genuinely human qualities, ideality, reverence, and real beauty that can only ever properly develop and flourish in what he calls the upper stories of our own being. He points here to former Harvard President Eliot once again as a shining example of a man whose considerable executive talents that could easily have made him one of the very wealthiest financiers in the entire country, were instead deliberately placed in humble, faithful service to something considerably higher and finer than mere personal wealth. Marden closes his entire book with the honest, sobering reminder that we simply cannot escape what he calls life's great balance sheet, that whatever we ultimately choose to sacrifice, whether it's our own finer senses given up in some restless chase after mere money, or our own material comfort given up in patient, quiet service to some higher and better ideal, we will, in the end, most certainly and most fully be asked to pay the honest price of that particular choice. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of Orison Swett Marden's Making Life a Masterpiece. We've walked together through the deep and lasting difference between merely earning a living and genuinely making a life, through the quiet, patient dignity of practical dreaming, through the hidden acres of diamonds waiting patiently right beneath our own 2 feet, through the surprising and quietly triumphant power of entirely ordinary virtues, through the sheer, dogged persistence that keeps sailing steadily on long after all outward hope seems genuinely gone, to the real cost and real reward of physical vigor honestly and carefully preserved, through the simple but liberating cure for chronic, draining indecision, through the sudden, startling revelation of powers we never even suspected we carried within ourselves, through the small, patient daily habit of quietly bettering our own personal best, through the driving, propulsive force of will that genuinely and fully means to succeed, through the steady, quiet backbone of simple honesty, through the settled and deliberate habit of finally doing the hardest thing first, through the true and lasting kingship of hard-won self-control, through the surprisingly enormous power of just one well-used hour each day, through the patient, honest work of finally finding our own true place in the world, through the deliberate, cultivated habit of genuine happiness, and finally, into that finer, higher, more truly human way of living that Marden believed, in the end, was really the entire point of the whole undertaking. If there's one single thread running through everything Marden has shared with us today, it is simply this: the raw material for a genuinely masterful life was never something rare or reserved only for the specially gifted few. It has been sitting quietly within you the entire time, patiently waiting for nothing more than your own honest, steady, daily decision to finally pick up the brush and actually begin the painting. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and with Orison Swett Marden. If these ideas gave you something genuinely worth carrying forward into your own life, please consider subscribing to the channel so these kinds of journeys keep finding their way to you. Until next time, take up your own brush today and add one honest, steady stroke to your own quiet masterpiece. And I will see you in the next one.